Well, everything happens for a reason. Fred was an idealistic young man in his early 20s with an unwavering conservative Christian faith and tried hard to maintain an even-keeled mood in the face of adversary. Upon having learned that his cousin was involved in a near-fatal automobile accident that left him critically injured with a lengthy recovery period, Fred went to the hospital and met his relatives and addressed his family's grief and anxiety. Fred's go-to approach was recurrent reassurance that everything happens for a reason and that all is happening according to God's plan. No matter the level of grief and misery Fred got confronted with, he stoically reassured everyone that their tears, angers, or questioning were unwarranted and that this occurrence is all part of the happier story that we have not seen the fruits of yet. Cherie was an energetic and eager young woman in her mid-30s who went through a traumatic divorce from her husband 12 years 2 days ago. Cherie was actively hopeful in recapturing the feeling of being married and the emotional security that came from it. Friends at work introduced her to a man who appeared to be somewhat questionable candidate for a long-term relationship. Those close to her suggested she might not want to place too much energy into developing a relationship. Despite their friends and wise counsel, and this new man's erratic moods and financial issues, Cherie was not deterred. She reassured her friends that being introduced was sort of a validation of the investment because everything happens for a reason. She continued forward with this new man, confident that whatever was to occur was somehow meant to be. Simone was an educated yet eccentric woman who was just out of her teens, who placed a great deal of thought into places, people, and events that happened around her. She would develop an almost fundamentalist scientific view of how these elements intertwine and are interlocked both literally and figuratively. She believed that there was an underlying governing plan for the universe, that each event that occurred in her life had a celestial meaning and message for her to understand and appropriately respond to. Simone felt that she must conform to this plan and not disrupt what had been scheduled to happen. She deliberately, deeply, on seemingly random happenings and relationship transactions, looking for this deep river of meaning that could tell her what the next step in her journey would be. As a result, her life is frequently bogged down to a snail's pace due to her anxiety and deliberation. The regular criticism directed towards anyone who believes that some event is part of a bigger plan or conspiracy is anyone who believes in conspiracy theories is actually trying to resist the reality that sometimes insignificant people can cause meaningful and or tragic acts. Sometimes things are just actually how they appear to be and do not contain a deeper meaning or set of circumstances behind them. In other words, these folks get wholesale criticism and dismissed because they believe things are more complicated than they really are. There has always been a battle that continues on in mainstream culture about how to interpret history. No better example of this is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. One side suggested that a lone gunman simply acted out his anger and shot an impossible shot that defied the laws of physics. And the other side wove a grandiose collusion between intelligence agencies and Cuban exiles. The diehards have trouble keeping it straight without a scorecard, and much rancor and continued name-calling had gone back and forth. We have always struggled as a people to make sense of why things happen, and what force or lack of force is behind them. One of the biggest issues that I get regularly during sessions is, why do bad things happen to good people? And how to understand death and tragedy in the bigger picture of life, and in terms of personal religious belief and theology. This is valid and absolutely necessary set of questions that resides in the heart of making sense of life. From my perspective, I would agree with the premise of logotherapy that argues that the primary motivational force of an individual is to find meaning in life, and that the mental health issues come from an inability to either be on this journey or an inability to complete this journey and answer the question to one's own satisfaction. Everyone I have ever spoken with in a session, and this is an admittedly select group, as people who don't care about the meaning of life don't generally show up in a therapist's office, has tried to answer this question in one shape or another and struggled to get it right in their own mind. Overall, I would say that existential questions, things that relate to our basic existence on the planet, are absolutely necessary, understandably so, and we have to come up with an answer to have any meaningful quality of life. I have run across people who were either too complacent or too simple to do much pondering about their life. These people tend to sort of live either with a dull laziness or with consistent gratification and daily pursuit of pleasure on their mind. They are not people who will be downloading and reading this book, and are probably not like any of the three individuals above in my scenarios. Let's take a look at what Fred, Cherie, and Simone were actually trying to say in these little vignettes about how they view the meaning of life, and what their underlying assumptions and values actually are. Starting with our friend Fred. I will make the argument that his take is the most commonly experienced one I see in sessions, and is the simplest one to make sense of. Fred has taken the generic position that all sadness and grief can and should be responded by a general and vague sense that all this emotional reaction is completely unnecessary because there is clearly something bigger and better that it is part of. Fred also believed that the grieving party should take to heart that everything has gone accordingly to some plan. Does this belief really hold water and make sense? For it to be true, it would mean that each individual tragedy is planned and scheduled, seen within a bigger self-contained movie. It would also mean that there would be a specific payoff to both the person who suffered and the person grieving that suffering. I always contest the Fred style of interpreting life is the manner theologically by asking them about 9/11. What was the greater good of the hundreds and hundreds of people who were forced by unbearable heat and smoke to hurl themselves out of the towers to certain death below? Without fail, the individuals will start backpedaling from this statement, belatedly suggest that maybe they are not right, and not everything in life is a part of a bigger and better movie with a great ending to come. More often than not, Fred doesn't even believe that everything is a part of a bigger scene with a happy ending, actually. He was simply avoiding a complicated and emotional and messy counter with someone who probably has a completely justifiable reason to feel terrible over a true loss. Fred tried to give some well-intentioned comfort to get the grieving party through a difficult moment. Usually the party that was grieving will understand that Fred was trying to be a good friend and won't take Fred's comments that seriously. In the next example, we have Cherie trying to make sense of a dating relationship and determine exactly what her responsibility will be in making sure that she's making good decisions in the relationship and will continue in a healthy manner. When she was confronted with the facts based on her own experience that this new relationship started off poorly, Cherie came to the conclusion that this new man may not be the best candidate. Due to his impulsive nature, which caused him to leave jobs, making him not the most reliable provider, she did not process this directly. Neither did Cherie spend much energy thinking about the other parts of the relationship either, such as whether this new boyfriend has control of his emotions, whether his moodiness was a sign of some dark depression or lack of anger control, or whether he can provide her any real meaningful security, either emotionally or physically. Cherie did not stop to ask what his values and beliefs were on a whole variety of subjects, such as being in a committed relationship, raising children, managing money, faith, and personal ethics, and so on. Instead, she bypassed all of her personal responsibility to do this forensic investigation and reality testing with this man and went straight to a passive dependence on fate to make her decision for her. Lots of people place a stamp of approval on an event by saying everything happens for a reason and have avoided the personal decision-making process themselves. It appears Cherie has chosen a passive emotional comfort over the stress and uncertainty of having to make stressful and impactful decision that could either be a positive or negative one for the rest of her life. What Cherie may have been doing as a way of managing life events is what I've referred to as premature sanctioning. Let me give you an example. I had an acquaintance of mine from high school who went through a messy divorce that became public knowledge via social media, where it became a topic of discussion. One of his friends suggested that he try and get back on the horse by trying an online dating service that spent some time trying to convince him of its virtues on a specific thread. This acquaintance replied back to him with, "Thanks, but God sent me a wonderful woman and we're dating and involved now." All I could think of when I read this is, it's a little early to know whether God sent this woman to you or whether you found her all by yourself. Not surprisingly, this new woman disappeared from his social media post, and he went on to pursue other avenues for dating. It is a common tendency for people to automatically pronounce a positive final outcome on a relationship that is either promising or one that someone really, really hopes will work out. My experience has been that people in general have a hard time maintaining the necessary emotional distance that it takes to remain objective and stay in a position of evaluation during a dating relationship that would allow one to be able to be in it, but still be able to watch it to see if it is working or is appropriate to stay in. This desire to avoid the uncertainty of the future is a key motivation to pronounce that everything happens for a reason for her and many others that I have seen and continue to work with. Simone adopted a much more intense usage of this phrase and did not use it to try and respond to singular event as Fred and Cherie have done in previous vignettes, but rather as a complete backdrop on how to interpret the whole of life as contained within the universe in which she lived. It appeared that Simone had placed an interpretation on the universe as having completely synchronized set of gears that meshed perfectly together, working exactly as they were intended. At first, this seemed to provide her with a general sense of emotional security, due to the belief that all events happen intentionally, which suggested that we were all in good hands and part of a bigger plan at work. This would also suggest initially that one could relax and not spend an excessive amount of time worrying about individual events, as everything that happens is planned. The problem, though, starts pretty quickly when you start trying to figure out where your place is in this whole set of moving and synchronized gears, and what you should do not to screw up these wonderworks. I once had a client that took this belief to an extreme, but a logical extreme, and spent hours agonizing in guilt over the possibility that he may have spent 15 minutes too long at the grocery store, or having not been in the right place at the right time. He wanted desperately to not throw a monkey wrench into the universe's grand plan and run afoul of its creator. Simone was headed down this same road, and was trying to figure out how to crack this celestial code and understand how to see gears clearly and determine what her next move should be and where the most recent events fit into the overarching plot. She will, naturally, have an increase in anxiety and try to find her place in the universe. My initial reaction when people bring these concerns in my direction is to empathetically agree that we all need to figure out to a reasonable degree how the world and universe work to the best of our own limited understandings and perceptions. This is in no way a task that is either an easy one to be taken lightly. The question I believe that is the hardest one of us all to answer: how do we respond to the randomness of life, and how do we deal with it? I think this can be applied to everyone regardless of religious beliefs or worldviews. I would argue as strongly as I would about anything that I believe that some things in life are absolutely random and occur without any celestial sanction. There is not a perfect set of gears turning that somehow overrides our own free will to do and act independently and spontaneously. This does not mean believe life is completely random and chaotic, with no underlying rules or order, or that there is not a spiritual force underlying everything we do and experience. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I believe I would be hard-pressed to lay out a schematic drawing of how the universe works in exact detail. I suspect you understand exactly what I mean here. It does appear that some things are completely random, and what we see and experience that other things seem to be part of a larger order and have some greater meaning. In this instance, however, Simone has overcomplicated her view in the world and struggled to find a giant spiderweb of security and control to somehow get into lockstep so that every move is the right move. One of the traits I look for in others that I think is a telltale sign of emotional health and emotional maturity is just how much uncertainty and ambiguity that someone can accept and live with. We would all like concrete answers to complicated questions, and we would all like the security of knowing why things happen when and where they do. I think that's a given. The reality is that there will always be things that occur in each of our lives that defy immediate explanation, that we are all faced with and the overwhelming realization that we are not completely in control of our destiny and probability, that no one else is moving us like a chess piece intentionally around the board either. It is a hard pill to swallow, and to consciously accept that going to the wrong convenience store at the wrong time could get you shot during a robbery, or that you might meet your spouse there, or that taking a few minutes longer than expected in the candy aisle might propel you out of or into a big car accident on County Road 12, or that the person you are falling in love with might be the right person to marry or have children with, or a terrible choice that will leave you divorced and brokenhearted, or maybe is the right choice and ends up dying young with a fatal illness. There is a level of uncertainty in life that we all have to make sense of, and preferably work through, to the point of being able to make assertive and well-educated decisions, and not to be overcome by what we don't know and don't have control over. Even worse, there is a second reality that when we do make decisions, there is no guarantee that they're the right ones or will work out well. So it's fair to say that someone that is being clear-headed and honest with themselves will have the painful awareness that decisions we make do have drastic implications for the rest of our lives and the lives of those around us. That's a big thing to wrestle with and subdue too. Overall, I'm going to argue that while I cannot say for sure exactly how, in specific detail, that they should try and make sense of complicated human experience, but that I want them to make a reasonably honest effort to try. There are those that make emotionally honest efforts to try to make sense of the world and display themselves as exactly that. And then there are those who make emotionally dishonest efforts to make sense of the world that are intended to cheat the process and avoid deep thoughts and existential wrestling. My argument to the belief statement that everything happens for a reason is that this could only be completely true if we were robotic players in a scripted existence where we individually had no freedom of choice nor ability to exert our own will. I would also argue that every single one of us is charged with making an honest attempt to make some sense of the reality that both good and evil exist simultaneously on our planet, and that sometimes things happen, both as a result of their intermingling and sometimes from just physical nature itself, that are beyond reasonable explanation and our control. My belief is that the more control we accept not having, the more emotional strength and resilience we will develop, and the better our inner lives become. I realize that some will try to and use a cognitive belief shortcut, like everything happens for a reason, to try to find inner peace and respite from life's struggles to truly grasp the gravity of life. But there is no guarantee that where and how you find this peace is really truthful and helpful in the long run. I believe that a more truthful statement to explain the complications of this life would be, everything does not happen for a reason, but some things do, and are a part of a larger scheme of things, and it is our job to try and tell the difference between the two. Simone, Fred, and Cherie all mysteriously start getting their morning coffee, at Starbucks off Bellevue Parkway around the same time on Monday morning. Eventually, somehow and some way, they develop a conversational relationship that leads them to get to know each other. They also start having weekly round table discussions over their mocha lattes. I'm reaching here, I know. Fred starts reconsidering his way of managing the awareness that bad things happen to people around him, and that these things cause them to feel pain and grief, and that he has been avoiding empathizing with their experience. He begins to become better at reflecting these painful moments and living in them, rather than avoiding them with superficial platitudes. Cherie began discussing her relationship problems and pulls back the responsibility she was trying to push away to make her own life better, and she has indeed some control over what her intermediate future looks like, and by her own choices and decisions. She decided to pull the brakes on a negative dating experience, despite really wanting to be in a committed relationship, and that not everyone that wants her is sent there by the powers that be. Cherie became more selective about future dates. Simone started relaxing her anxious desire to know where every block fits into the cosmic plan, and began to see life in less specific and more general outcome-based themes. Before long, her contemplation shifted from neurotic and constricting to thoughtful and strategic. She developed a much healthier view of life and decides she wants to return to school and serve the world by pursuing a degree in social work and attacking the problem of homelessness. All three move away from the idea that everything happens for a reason as a dogmatic belief and accept that they have more or less control over their lives than this statement allowed. The threesome develop a much healthier